I am absolutely furious right now, and honestly, you should be too. Why? Because the American Heart Association has just released new blood pressure guidelines, and they are more aggressive, more restrictive, and in my view, more dangerous than ever before. This is not just a minor update. This could change the way millions of people are treated, especially older adults. And the sad reality? These new rules may lead to more unnecessary medications, more side effects, and ultimately, more suffering. The real problem with aggressive guidelines. Let's start with a simple truth. Yes, high blood pressure is risky. Nobody is denying that. Hypertension is linked to stroke, heart failure, kidney disease, and even dementia. But here's the other side of the story. Overtreating blood pressure can be just as harmful, if not worse, especially in people over the age of 65. I see this over and over. Patients who have been prescribed 2, 3, sometimes even 4 blood pressure drugs over the years. They walk into the hospital feeling weak, dizzy, and sometimes so unstable they fall and injure themselves. Their blood pressure is so low that their brain and other organs simply aren't getting enough blood. That's not good medicine. That's harm caused by overtreatment. What the new guidelines say. So what exactly did the American Heart Association do? They now define normal blood pressure as less than 120/80 mmHg. Elevated blood pressure is now 120/129 systolic. Stage 1 hypertension is 130/139 mmHg systolic. Stage 2 hypertension starts at 140 mmHg and above, and severe hypertension is anything above 180 mmHg. This means that if your blood pressure is 124 or 125 systolic, the top number, you are now officially elevated. That's right, what was once considered perfectly fine is suddenly labeled as a medical problem. Now here's the million-dollar question. Why make this change? Who benefits from classifying more people as hypertensive? Is it really about saving lives, or is it about selling more drugs? The pharmaceutical angle. Let's not be naive. The more people classified as at risk, the more prescriptions are written. The blood pressure drug market is already massive, and these guidelines virtually guarantee millions more patients will be put on medication earlier and for longer periods of time. And here's the real kicker. Many of these patients don't need them. They're not in danger at 124 systolic. But now, with these new rules, doctors, who are trained to follow guidelines like robots, will feel pressure to prescribe. It's an incredibly aggressive approach, and it's going to impact countless people, especially seniors. Lifestyle advice, too simplified. Of course, the AHA includes some lifestyle advice, but let's look at what they emphasize. Eat less salt, eat more fruits and vegetables, drink less alcohol. That's it. That's their big recommendation for tackling high blood pressure. Now, don't get me wrong, those tips aren't bad. Reducing alcohol is smart. Eating vegetables is smart. But do you notice what's missing? The single biggest driver of modern hypertension: insulin resistance. Most people with high blood pressure today aren't suffering because they sprinkled a little too much salt on their dinner. They're suffering because their diets are filled with processed carbs, sugars, and junk foods. They're sitting all day, not moving enough, and their bodies are becoming resistant to insulin. This condition doesn't just raise blood sugar, it also raises blood pressure. Yet the official guidelines barely mention it. How can the leading heart health organizations in the United States ignore this? How can they fail to address the root cause that is fueling an epidemic of hypertension across the Western world? The hidden cost of ignoring root causes. Here's the problem. When doctors focus only on blood pressure numbers, they miss the bigger picture. Hypertension is a symptom, not the root disease. And if we only treat the symptom with medication, people stay sick. They stay dependent on pills for life. Imagine a patient with high blood pressure caused by years of poor diet, lack of exercise, and insulin resistance. Instead of addressing the diet, the exercise, and the lifestyle, they get a prescription, then another, then another. Suddenly their blood pressure is lower, but they're weak, dizzy, and still insulin resistant. The root problem hasn't been solved. The disease hasn't been reversed. It's just been covered up. And worse, these medications pile up. A 70-year-old on 3 antihypertensives isn't healthier. They're often weaker, more fragile, and at greater risk of falls, fractures, and hospitalization. Why the anger? This is why I'm furious, because the very organizations that claim to protect public health are making decisions that ignore root causes, ignore real patient outcomes, and conveniently align with pharmaceutical interests. It's not just a mistake, it's a systemic failure. The American Heart Association has a long history of questionable recommendations. They were once deeply involved in promoting processed foods and margarine while demonizing natural fats. They've been funded by industries that benefit from their official advice. And now, here we are again. More aggressive blood pressure guidelines, more drugs, less discussion of real solutions. What we should be talking about instead. If we really want to fight high blood pressure, here's what we should focus on. Diet quality. Cut processed carbs, reduce sugar, and prioritize real, whole foods. Movement. Daily exercise, even walking, makes a huge difference in blood pressure and insulin sensitivity. Weight management. Losing even a small amount of excess weight can dramatically reduce blood pressure. Stress and sleep. Chronic stress and poor sleep elevate blood pressure in ways that pills can't fully fix. Personalized medicine. Not everyone needs the same target blood pressure, especially seniors who may not tolerate low levels well. These are the strategies that actually change lives, reverse disease, and reduce the need for medication, not just cover up symptoms. The speaker calls this a catastrophe of epic proportions, and I agree. Because these guidelines aren't just numbers on paper, they shape how millions of doctors practice medicine. They determine how millions of patients are treated, and they may push us further away from solving the real causes of hypertension. Instead of healthier patients, we may end up with overmedicated, weaker patients. Instead of addressing insulin resistance and poor lifestyle, we'll be chasing numbers with drugs. And instead of empowering people to take control of their health, we'll be turning more and more of them into lifelong customers of the pharmaceutical industry. So here's my advice to you. Question everything. Don't accept new guidelines at face value. Ask your doctor not just what your blood pressure is, but why. Is it truly dangerous? Is it caused by your diet, your weight, your lifestyle? Or is it simply a number that falls into a new category invented by a committee? Medicine should be about treating people, not numbers, about addressing root causes, not masking symptoms, and about empowering patients, not turning them into dependent consumers. That's why I'm angry. And I think you should be too. If this message resonates with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more content, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Together, we need to push back against shallow solutions and focus on real health. Let's dig even deeper into why these blood pressure guidelines are not just overly aggressive, but potentially harmful on a large scale. One of the biggest dangers of this new system is the concept of medical creep, the slow but steady expansion of what is considered a disease. For decades, a systolic blood pressure of 140 was the general cutoff. Anything below that was usually acceptable unless there were other health problems. But with each new guideline, the threshold gets lower and lower. Now, if your reading is 124, you're already on the radar. This shift doesn't just affect statistics, it changes the lives of millions of people overnight, because suddenly, they're told they have a condition they didn't know they had. In practice, here's what happens. Someone goes in for a routine checkup. Their blood pressure reads 128. Under the old system, this would not have raised eyebrows. But under the new guidelines, they may be told, "You have elevated blood pressure. We need to monitor you closely. You may need medication." This creates anxiety, and once anxiety sets in, patients often become hyper-focused on their numbers. They check their blood pressure multiple times a day, worry when it fluctuates, and eventually accept medication they may not have needed in the first place. Now extend this to the elderly population. Imagine a 70-year-old with borderline numbers who is suddenly placed on 2 antihypertensive drugs. Their blood pressure drops too low, they feel lightheaded, and one slip on the bathroom floor turns into a fractured hip and a long hospital stay. In trying to prevent a stroke 10 years down the line, we've caused immediate harm today. When you look closely at the scientific data, it's not as black and white as the guidelines suggest. Yes, very high blood pressure is undeniably dangerous. But the benefit of pushing blood pressure lower and lower is not always clear-cut, especially in older adults. For instance, some studies show that aggressive lowering of blood pressure in seniors does not necessarily improve survival. In fact, excessively low blood pressure has been linked to increased risk of falls, kidney damage, and even worse outcomes in patients with existing heart conditions. Medicine should be about balance, not absolutes. Yet the guidelines promote a lower is always better mindset that doesn't reflect reality. Let's return to the root issue that almost no major guideline highlights: insulin resistance. When the body becomes resistant to insulin, it doesn't just cause high blood sugar, it triggers a cascade of other problems. Blood vessels stiffen, inflammation increases, and kidneys retain more sodium. All of this drives blood pressure upward. This is why people who are pre-diabetic or diabetic often have hypertension as well. But here's the key. If you address insulin resistance through lifestyle, better diet, exercise, and weight management, blood pressure often normalizes on its own. I've seen countless cases where people who cut out processed foods, reduced their sugar intake, and moved more saw dramatic improvements in both blood sugar and blood pressure. Yet the guidelines barely whisper about this connection. Instead, they stick to simplistic advice like, eat less salt, which for many people is not the core problem at all. It's worth pausing on this point. For decades, salt has been demonized as the villain behind high blood pressure. And yes, in certain individuals, salt sensitivity is real. But research has repeatedly shown that the effects of salt on blood pressure vary dramatically from person to person. Some people see a modest rise, others barely change at all. Meanwhile, the impact of sugar and processed carbohydrates on blood pressure and insulin resistance is consistently strong, yet largely ignored in mainstream guidelines. This obsession with salt reduction is not only outdated, it's a distraction. People get the impression that if they just put away the salt shaker, their blood pressure problem will be solved. In reality, they could still be consuming mountains of bread, pasta, soda, and processed snacks that are quietly fueling hypertension behind the scenes. This raises an uncomfortable but necessary question. Why does the system work this way? Why do guidelines ignore root causes? The unfortunate answer is that lifestyle interventions don't generate profit. There's no money in telling people to eat better and move more, but there is endless profit in prescribing lifelong medications. Pharmaceutical companies benefit from expanded definitions of disease. The more people labeled as hypertensive, the more prescriptions written. And doctors? Many of them are simply following orders. Medical education emphasizes guideline compliance. Physicians are evaluated on whether they hit targets, not whether their patients feel healthier or stronger. As a result, many doctors become rule followers instead of critical thinkers. They don't question whether a 125 blood pressure really needs intervention. They just follow the chart. This doesn't mean we should ignore blood pressure. It is a real risk factor, and uncontrolled hypertension is dangerous. But the answer is not to chase ever lower numbers with more pills. The smarter path is to focus on overall health. Here's what that means in practical terms. Monitor blood pressure wisely. Don't obsess over a single reading. Blood pressure fluctuates throughout the day. Look at patterns, not isolated numbers. Prioritize lifestyle first. Address diet, exercise, stress, and sleep before resorting to medication. For many, this alone can bring blood pressure back into a healthy range. Individualized treatment. What works for a 40-year-old with obesity may not work for a healthy but frail 75-year-old. Targets should be personalized. Question the narrative. Don't blindly accept that 124 is elevated simply because a committee said so. Ask whether lowering that number with drugs will truly benefit you. Stay informed, understand the role of insulin resistance, and take active steps to reverse it. This means cutting processed foods, reducing sugars, and improving metabolic health. Behind every guideline is a human being, the 68-year-old grandmother who now believes she's sick because her blood pressure is 126, the middle-aged man who adds a new prescription to his already long list, even though his real problem is a poor diet, the older adult who faints in the bathroom because their blood pressure was driven too low. These aren't abstract statistics. These are real lives. And every time the definition of normal shifts downward, more people fall into the trap of overmedication and fear. We're living in an era where chronic disease is exploding. Obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome. These are the real drivers of hypertension. And yet the official response is to push pills earlier, harder, and in greater numbers. That is not a solution. That's damage control at best and profiteering at worst. If we continue down this road, we will see millions of people burdened by unnecessary treatment, with little improvement in actual health outcomes. The tragedy is not just medical, it's personal. It robs people of energy, independence, and quality of life. One of the most overlooked aspects of the blood pressure debate is how aging changes the rules of the game. A blood pressure that looks too high on paper for a 30-year-old might actually be protective for someone who is 75. That's because as we age, our arteries naturally stiffen, our blood vessels lose elasticity, and the body requires a slightly higher pressure to maintain proper blood flow to the brain and other vital organs. But guidelines rarely account for this nuance. Instead, they set rigid numbers, 120, 130, 140, and apply them universally. This cookie-cutter approach doesn't respect biology, it doesn't respect individuality, and it can be downright dangerous. Why low isn't always better? Consider the brain. It's one of the most energy-hungry organs in the body, consuming 20% of our oxygen supply. When blood pressure is pushed too low, especially in older adults, the brain simply doesn't get enough blood. The result? Dizziness, confusion, memory lapses, and in some cases, fainting. Ironically, while the guidelines claim lowering blood pressure protects against dementia, the reality is that excessively low pressure may actually increase the risk of cognitive decline because of chronic underperfusion. The kidneys are another organ at risk. They rely on steady blood pressure to filter waste. Over-lowering pressure can starve them of blood flow, leading to impaired function. This is why many elderly patients on multiple blood pressure drugs end up with declining kidney health, even though their numbers on the chart look perfect. The human cost of a number game. It's important to step back and ask, who are we really helping when we tighten these targets? Imagine a man in his early 70s. He's active, enjoys gardening, walks every day, and has no major health issues. His blood pressure is 132/82. Under the new system, he's now classified as hypertensive. His doctor recommends medication. Within weeks, his pressure drops to 112/70, but suddenly he feels fatigued, lightheaded when he stands, and he trips more often. This is not a victory. It's a downgrade in quality of life. And yet, on paper, the guidelines would declare success because the number is lower. This highlights a critical flaw. Medicine should measure success by how patients feel and function, not just by how numbers look. The pharmaceutical domino effect. Once a patient starts on one blood pressure medication, something else often happens. Side effects. Maybe it's a cough from an ACE inhibitor, swollen ankles from a calcium channel blocker, or dizziness from a beta blocker. What's the typical medical response? Add another pill to counteract the side effect. Before long, a patient who started with one mild issue is on 5 or 6 prescriptions. This domino effect is not rare. It's the norm. In medical terms, it's called polypharmacy. In human terms, it's called a nightmare, and it's driven in large part by rigid guidelines that push doctors to medicate aggressively. Why lifestyle gets pushed aside. Another tragedy in all of this is how lifestyle interventions get sidelined. When a patient hears they have hypertension, they're often told medication is inevitable. But that's not true. For many people, diet and exercise changes can work wonders. Cutting processed foods, reducing sugar intake, losing a modest amount of weight, these can all drop blood pressure by 10-20 points or more. That's equivalent to or better than what some medications achieve. But these solutions require effort, time, and commitment. Pills, on the other hand, are quick, easy, and profitable. This is why guidelines lean so heavily toward pharmacology. They don't leave enough room for the reality that many patients could fix their pressure without drugs if they were given the right tools, education, and support. The bigger health picture. What makes this issue even more troubling is that high blood pressure is rarely an isolated problem. It often sits alongside obesity, high cholesterol, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes. Together, these form what is known as metabolic syndrome. Here's the key point. If you improve metabolic health, you often fix blood pressure as a side effect. Address the root, and the symptoms resolve. But if you only chase the blood pressure number, the root disease keeps growing, silently causing damage. That's why focusing only on blood pressure without addressing insulin resistance is like trying to mop up water from a leaking roof without repairing the hole. You might clean the puddle, but the damage continues above your head. The psychological trap. There's also a psychological angle that can't be ignored. When people are told their blood pressure is elevated or stage 1 hypertension, they often internalize the label of being sick. Even if they feel perfectly fine, the diagnosis creates stress. Ironically, stress itself can raise blood pressure, creating a vicious cycle. Labels matter, and by lowering the threshold for disease, these guidelines label millions of otherwise healthy people as patients in need of treatment. This medicalizes normal variation and turns health into illness. What we should demand. If medicine truly cared about long-term health, the conversation would look very different. Instead of telling patients to hit arbitrary numbers, doctors would be trained to ask, what is causing this person's blood pressure to rise? Is medication absolutely necessary, or can we reverse it with lifestyle first? What pressure range is safest for this individual, given their age, activity level, and overall health? How do we protect the patient's quality of life, not just their numbers? This is the type of personalized medicine that people deserve. But until the system changes, it's up to individuals to question, to learn, and to advocate for themselves. The silent consequences of blind compliance doctors, unfortunately, are often judged by whether they follow guidelines, not by whether their patients thrive. Insurance companies, hospitals, and regulators measure compliance through numbers. Did the patient's blood pressure fall below 130? If yes, the doctor is considered successful. If not, they're seen as failing. This system pressures physicians to medicate aggressively. It leaves little room for common sense, clinical judgment, or individualized care. And ultimately, it sacrifices patient well-being at the altar of statistics. Another overlooked element of the blood pressure conversation is how context changes everything. A reading of 135/85 means something very different for an obese, sedentary 40-year-old than it does for a lean, active 75-year-old. Yet guidelines treat them the same. By flattening human diversity into a single chart, we end up ignoring critical factors like age, physical fitness, diet quality, stress levels, and even genetics. A one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work in clothing, and it certainly doesn't work in medicine. Flawed logic of prevention. The justification for lowering thresholds is always prevention. If we catch hypertension early, we can prevent heart attacks and strokes. On the surface, that sounds reasonable, but prevention shouldn't mean medicating millions of healthy people for decades. Real prevention means eliminating the root causes: unhealthy diets, lack of movement, chronic stress, not handing out pills at the first sign of slightly elevated numbers. side effects, and hidden risks. Every medication comes with trade-offs. Antihypertensives can cause fatigue, dizziness, electrolyte imbalances, kidney stress, and sexual dysfunction. These effects aren't rare. They're common. And yet patients are rarely warned just how impactful they can be. Worse, when side effects appear, they're often mistaken for new illnesses. Low energy? Must be aging. Erectile dysfunction? Maybe it's psychological. Swelling in the legs? Probably another condition. So more drugs are added, each masking the damage caused by the last. This is how countless older adults end up with pill boxes so full they can barely keep track. Not because they're sicker, but because the system keeps piling on treatments without ever asking whether the first prescription was necessary in the first place. The role of nutrition and movement contrast this with lifestyle interventions. Regular walking, strength training, and a diet low in processed foods can dramatically lower blood pressure. Not only that, but these habits improve nearly every marker of health: blood sugar, cholesterol, inflammation, body weight, even mental well-being. This is what real medicine should look like. Not a prescription-first model, but a lifestyle-first approach. Pills can play a role when absolutely necessary, but they should be the last resort, not the first step. Historical perspective. It's worth remembering that this isn't the first time guidelines have caused controversy. The American Heart Association once promoted margarine and vegetable oils over natural fats, a stance now widely criticized. They demonized cholesterol while ignoring the role of processed sugar. Mistakes like these have shaped decades of public health, and we're still living with the consequences today. The new blood pressure guidelines feel like history repeating itself. A simple narrative pushed onto a complex problem, while the deeper truths, like insulin resistance, are left out of the conversation. The global problem. And it's not just the United States. Western countries across the globe often copy these guidelines, meaning the ripple effect is massive. Millions in Europe, Canada, and beyond will also be labeled hypertensive under these rules. The pharmaceutical market grows, but do people really get healthier, or do they just get medicated? The cost of ignoring root causes. By not addressing insulin resistance, obesity, and lifestyle, we're setting ourselves up for long-term failure. High blood pressure is not just about the heart. It's a sign of a body under metabolic stress. Ignore the cause, and you end up treating a symptom forever. Address the cause, and you unlock the possibility of true recovery. This is why so many patients who change their diets, lose weight, and move more find themselves not only lowering blood pressure, but also reversing prediabetes, improving cholesterol, and regaining energy. These are the real success stories that guidelines should promote. A call for common sense. If lowering blood pressure by 10 points with lifestyle changes makes you stronger, healthier, and more energetic, that's a win. If lowering blood pressure by 10 points with pills leaves you dizzy, exhausted, and dependent, that's a loss. Yet both outcomes look identical on paper. This is the fundamental flaw of number-driven medicine. The takeaway for viewers. The truth is this: blood pressure is important, but context, cause, and quality of life matter more. Guidelines may shift, definitions may tighten, and thresholds may change, but your health should not be reduced to a number on a chart. Your best defense is knowledge. Understand what really drives high blood pressure. Question whether medication is truly necessary. And remember that real prevention begins with lifestyle, not prescriptions. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear your perspective. Have you or someone you know been affected by these shifting blood pressure guidelines? Were you prescribed medication that left you feeling worse instead of better? Share your story in the comments below. I read everyone. And if this video resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and follow along for more content that goes beyond the headlines and digs into the real causes of health and disease. Because together, by asking better questions and demanding better answers, we can reclaim our health and our future.